It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself standing behind the counter at the 7-Eleven convenience store. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the shelves stocked with snacks and drinks. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., and I was all alone. The night had been quiet, as most nights on the graveyard shift tend to be. I had been working at this July 11th for a few months, and it was my first time working the midnight shift. My friends had warned me about strange occurrences that happened after hours, but I dismissed their stories as mere superstition. As I stared out at the empty parking lot through the foggy window, I heard a faint sound coming from one of the aisles. It was the soft jingle of a bell. I glanced at the entrance, but no one was there. I chalked it up to the wind and returned to my magazine. Minutes turned into hours, and the eerie feeling lingered. The bell continued to chime intermittently, each time sending a shiver down my spine. I finally decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and slowly made my way towards the source of the noise. The store seemed different at night, the shelves towering over me like menacing giants. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The freezer door was wide open, and a chilly mist hung in the air. I knew I had locked it securely before my shift began. I hesitated for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just a malfunction, but then I heard the whispering. It was a faint, haunting whisper that seemed to come from inside the freezer. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded desperate, like a trapped soul begging for release. I slowly approached the freezer and shone my flashlight inside. To my horror, I saw a figure huddled in the back, its pale, frozen face pressed against the glass. It was a woman, her eyes wide with terror, her lips blue and cracked. She was dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged to a different era. Without thinking, I grabbed the handle and tried to pull the freezer door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I heard the woman's whispers grow louder and more desperate. I could feel her fear and suffering, and it was overwhelming. I rushed back to the counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. As I frantically explained the situation to the operator, I glanced back at the freezer. The woman's face was now pressed so hard against the glass that her nose was bleeding. She mouthed words I couldn't understand, her eyes pleading for help. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but time seemed to slow down as I watched the woman's frozen form. Suddenly, with a bone-chilling scream, she shattered into 1,000 icy shards, leaving only a puddle of water on the freezer floor. The police arrived shortly after, but there was no evidence of the woman's presence, except for the shattered glass and the puddle of water. They searched the store and found no signs of forced entry or foul play. They questioned me extensively, but I couldn't provide any answers that made sense. As the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at the July 11th. I began hearing strange noises in the store, whispers in the aisles, footsteps in the empty backroom, and the incessant jingle of the bell at the entrance. Even when there was no one there, I tried to quit my job, but I couldn't find work elsewhere. Bills piled up, and I was trapped in a nightmare, night after night. The paranormal activity escalated. Shelves of merchandise were knocked over, and products flew off the shelves as if propelled by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder and more sinister, echoing through the store like a chorus of lost souls. One fateful night, as I stood behind the counter, the entire store seemed to come alive. The lights flickered violently, and the shelves began to shake. I watched in horror as a ghostly figure materialized in front of me, the same woman from the freezer, her eyes filled with rage. She pointed a bony finger at me and screamed, a blood-curdling sound that pierced my soul. The force of her scream knocked me to the ground, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. My vision blurred as darkness closed in around me. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned doctors and nurses. They told me I had suffered a heart attack and miraculously survived. But I knew the truth. I had come face to face with a malevolent spirit, trapped in the 7-Eleven for reasons unknown. I never returned to that cursed store, but the memories of that night still haunt me. I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, And I know that the woman's spirit lingers, trapped in the 7-Eleven, waiting for her story to be told, and her torment to end. I had always heard rumors about the 7-Eleven on Elm Street. People whispered about it, said it was cursed or haunted, but I never paid much attention. After all, it was just a convenience store, right? But that night, the night I was scheduled for the midnight shift, everything changed. I arrived at the July 11th just before midnight, greeted by the dim glow of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and hot dogs, and the eerie silence seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerators and the occasional distant rumble of a passing car. My name is Sarah, and I had taken this job to make ends meet while I finished college. I had worked plenty of late shifts before, but something about this place felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I was alone behind the counter, methodically restocking shelves and trying to keep myself occupied. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the only customers who wandered in were a few late-night stragglers looking for cigarettes or energy drinks. They paid no mind to me, lost in their own world. As the clock approached 1 a.m., I heard a soft creaking sound coming from the back of the store. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to listen over the hum of the refrigerators. There it was again, a subtle, rhythmic creaking, like someone slowly swinging a door back and forth. I cautiously made my way to the back of the store, my footsteps barely making a sound on the grimy linoleum floor. The creaking grew louder as I approached the storage room. My hand trembling, I pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me froze the blood in my veins. In the dim light, I saw a swing hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently as if moved by an invisible hand, but there was no one there. I knew I was alone in the store. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. What the hell was going on? I couldn't explain it, and my mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Maybe this place really was cursed. I returned to the front of the store, trying to shake off the fear that had taken hold of me, but as the night wore on, the strange occurrences continued. Shelves of snacks and candies seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. Items I had just restocked mysteriously vanished, and worst of all, I could hear faint, ghostly whispers echoing through the empty store. I tried to call my manager, but my phone had no signal. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I was trapped in this nightmare, alone and helpless. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the lights flickered, plunging the store into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, I found myself facing a row of bizarre and grotesque figures. They stood in the aisles, their pallid, decaying faces contorted in eerie smiles. Their eyes were empty, soulless voids. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of potato chips. The figures advanced toward me, their movements slow and deliberate. I could hear their whispers growing louder, filling my head with incomprehensible words. I turned and ran for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the exit, it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but there was no one to hear me. Desperation consumed me as the figures closed in, their grotesque hands reaching out for me. I turned to face them, my back against the locked door, tears streaming down my face. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into thin air. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, the store was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. I stumbled out of the July 11th, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the terror I had just experienced. I never returned to that cursed place again, and I quit my job the next day. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the mind, or something far more sinister? All I know is that the 7-Eleven on Elm Street holds secrets that should never be uncovered, and I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life. The dim, buzzing neon lights of the 7-Eleven cast eerie shadows as I stepped inside. It was one of those humid summer nights where the air felt heavy, and the convenience store beckoned with the promise of cool drinks and snacks. I never thought that this ordinary 7-Eleven would become the setting for a horror story that would haunt my nightmares. I walked down the narrow aisles, the cold air conditioning providing a welcome respite from the stifling heat outside. The store was empty except for a tired-looking cashier who barely glanced up as I entered. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unsettling rhythm of light and darkness. Something about the atmosphere felt off, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. As I wandered through the store, I noticed an old, wooden door hidden behind a shelf stocked with chips. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway that led deeper into the building. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore. What harm could come from a little adventure in a 7-Eleven, right? The hallway was lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the air grew noticeably colder as I ventured further. The sound of the convenience store faded behind me, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to thicken with each step. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but there was no one else in sight. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the hallway, and my heart sank. The door in front of me had no handle, no knob, and no way to open it. Panic crept over me as I turned to retrace my steps, but the hallway had disappeared. The wallpaper had morphed into a seamless, endless void, trapping me in a nightmarish maze. My phone, usually a source of comfort, was utterly useless. No signal, no flashlight, just a dead screen mocking me in the darkness. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath in front of me, forming a ghostly mist. I stumbled forward, the walls of the endless corridor closing in on me, their wallpaper shifting and contorting, as if they were alive. Whispers filled the air, eerie voices that seemed to come from all directions, their words indecipherable, yet undeniably malevolent. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I turned, and my heart stopped. A figure emerged from the darkness, its features obscured by a tattered hooded cloak. The only visible part of its face was a pair of piercing, crimson eyes that bore into my soul. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure drew closer, and I could see its fingers, long and bony, extending from the cloak. In one of its skeletal hands, it held a key, ornate and rusted, as if it had been there for centuries. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised the key and pointed it at the door I had initially entered through. The door swung open on its own, revealing a nightmarish scene beyond. The 7-Eleven I had known was now a twisted, grotesque parody of itself. The shelves were filled with decaying, rotting food, and the cashier's face was a mask of terror as he stared at me with hollow eyes. The figure gestured for me to go through the door, and I had no choice but to obey. As I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, and the hallway vanished, leaving me in this nightmarish version of the 7-Elevens. I was trapped in a living nightmare, surrounded by the stench of decay and the echoes of haunting whispers. The figure watched me, its crimson eyes never leaving mine. It seemed to feed on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. I knew then that I was not the first to be lured into this nightmarish trap, and I feared I wouldn't be the last. As I wandered through the twisted aisles of the 7-Eleven, I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to escape this living horror, or if I would become just another lost soul in this cursed convenience store.